This is a Sandy Boy Productions podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to All Have Another podcast with Lindsay Hine. I'm your host, Lindsay. Thank you so much for being here today. Today you're listening to episode 373, and my guest is Steve Magness. Steve is a performance coach, he's a writer, and he's the author of several books, including Peak Performance, The Passion Paradox, and The Science of Running. He's also the co-founder of The Growth Equation. You've heard from his business partner on that, Brad Stulberg, on this podcast several times. And Steve was the track and cross country coach for the University of Houston for quite a while. He also has a history back in the day. He worked with the Nike Oregon Project, and we get into that a little bit because he was one of the whistleblowers with everything that went on with Alberto Salazar. And it was something I didn't want to spend a ton of time on. However, I felt like it was really important to talk about it because it's a big part of his story. And so we touch on that, and we talk about the evolution of his own running as well in this episode. Steve is super well researched and educated and has so many great things to say. It was really a joy to talk to him in this episode. These are the kinds of episodes I just want to bottle up and keep forever, and I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to talk to people like Steve. So I really hope you enjoy the episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. If you do love it, please share it with your friends or leave us a rating and review on iTunes. We give away a pair of Gooder sunglasses every single month for new ratings and reviews. So just send us an email and let us know if you left a rating and review, and we announce those at the end of every month. However, I forgot to announce it last month. So this month, I want to shout out to Jenna L. She is our new rating and review for March that is winning the Gooder sunglasses. Jenna says, my favorite running, cooking, and driving buddy is Lindsay on this podcast. She's a natural, uncovering the deep stuff through normal conversation. So Jenna, send me an email, lindsay@sandyboyproductions.com, and we will get you your Gooder shades mailed to you. Friends, this podcast is sponsored by Gooder. If you are not already wearing Gooder shades, make sure you check them out. They are functional, fashionable, and they don't slip around when you're running. They have so many fun styles. I love the aviator shades and the breakfast run to Tiffany's. I'm always wearing those. You all can save 15% when you go to gooder.com/another and use the code another15 for 15% off your order. All right, friends, enjoy my conversation with Steve Magness. All right. Well, today on All Have Another, we have Steve Magness on the show. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
This is a true honor. I'm really excited to have you on the show, and quite frankly, it is overdue.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's been really fun. You know, I've followed you for a very long time, known lots about your career, but it's been fun, like prepping for this interview, diving in a little bit deeper and getting to know you a little bit more. I mean, the wide array of work that you do, how do you do everything that you do? As a mom, I get that question a lot, but honestly, I'm looking at all your work and I'm like, when do you do all these things?
Well, the secret is me and my wife don't have kids yet. So that's how it gets done. But I just like my passion is to follow and do interesting things. So if it's interesting to me, I just have this personality, just like I did with running, where it's like, okay, let's go all in for a minute. So because of that, I just try to use that to my advantage and go all in and get lost on things that are actually productive versus, spending too much time on the internet.
Okay. I love that you just brought that up right off the bat because that's something I've been thinking about a lot. I know you read tons of research and things like that. I spend a lot of time listening to podcasts and reading books. I don't necessarily read research papers like you, but I do ingest a lot. I love reading. In the morning, I love to spend, if I could, I would spend 2 hours reading before I do anything else. But it's too much time, right? I cannot spend that much time doing it. And sometimes I feel like I'm spending so much time ingesting that I want to spend more time outputting, but I love the input so much. But I know that I thrive off the creation process as well. So finding that like balance of bringing in and putting out is kind of challenging for me.
Oh yeah. I mean that's like the biggest challenge I think of for creatives. Because like, and there's research on this actually. You have to spend a lot of time exploring, which is like doing the reading, listening to podcasts, whatever, exposing yourself to ideas. But then if you just stay on that exploration phase, like you don't get to the other side, which is what they call exploiting, which is like turning that into something like creative and useful. So a lot of my work now is like trying to make sure I'm finding that balance for me. And I think that's important is what is that balance, for you? And I have to remind myself that because I'm like you, I get lost on if I could, I'd spend all my day like reading, going on walks and listening to podcasts and just like consuming information because it's interesting. But I have to be very intentional. And I have a notebook for this that I carry around. And I'm like, this is my ideas, like turning these things into something.
Yes.
And I'll just like jot down like, oh, I listened to this or read this. This might work really well as a article idea or a book idea. And I'm not going to get to everything, but just like having that thought of, that reminder of, well, what could I turn this into? What could this become a product of? I think that keeps me a little more balanced.
Well, and the action piece is sometimes where I get paralyzed, whereas like, you're going out on a walk or a run. I mean, how many times, and I'm sure listeners can agree with this, like you're on a run, you're 5 miles in, you're like, I have the best idea ever. This is like the best series for the podcast or X, Y, and Z. And you get home and whatever your life is, for me, it's like my kids need a million things or whatever it is. And I'm like, I'm gonna remember that. I'm gonna think about that and I'm gonna execute. And if really I spent 30 dedicated minutes to that thought, the next day, I'd probably get somewhere with it. But a lot of times I just like kind of move on and think, well, that sounded glamorous and fun while I was running, but like here's real life.
Yes, that's like there have been so many moments, especially when I'm in like the heart of book writing, where I'll just go on a run and I'll be like stuck on a chapter, not sure what to do, and the idea just pops into my head on the run, right? It's the creative process. It's great. But then I spend the rest of the run, the next like 4 or 5 miles, whatever, like trying to force myself to not forget this idea.
Right. That's like one time I was talking to Des Linden about this once, and I was like, do you stop when you have an idea and like take out your notes on your phone and write it down or whatever? And she's like, no, I just keep writing. I'm like, sometimes I really have to stop and do that or else I will forget. And if I think it's gold enough, I'm like, you got to stop and get the notes app out. Do you ever do that?
So I hate running with my phone, so I never have that. But when I'm again in book writing mode, what I did for a while, because I knew this was going to happen, is I just like tuck a little small piece of paper and then like a little pen in the side of my like in the key holder of my shorts, and I would stop because I was like, I know I'm going to figure out this thing I'm stuck on, so I got to have a way to like remember it.
Genius. I think it was Katie Arnold who wrote the memoir Running Home who said the same thing, which I don't really picture Katie Arnold being up in the mountains for 3 hours with her cell phone either. And I think it was Katie that said she actually like wrote it down with a pen. And I can see that being super helpful. Okay, Steve, we have to get into like so much in this hour. So first I want to know, how did you meet your wife? You mentioned your wife.
Yeah, we met through running.
Okay.
So she ran in college as well, and then post-collegiately she's a teacher in the Houston area where I lived. And the running community is small, so you meet other good runners and you start going on runs, and that's how it kind of started for us.
Yeah, and you got married relatively recently, didn't you?
Yeah, actually at the very beginning of the pandemic. So
that's interesting.
Yes, so it was wild. And but we made it through and adjusted the wedding and everything, and it turned out great.
So the wedding was like once pandemic had started.
Yes.
Oh gosh.
So it was like in the very beginning when people were still clueless and had no idea, and we couldn't like get out of it because it wasn't technically a disaster yet. So it was very stressful on top of, it being a wedding.
Oh
But
sure.
it tested us and we made it on the other side. So
Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear like in 5 years, 10 years, like people that did get married and have these like big life changes like that, or had a baby or whatever it may be during those beginning times of the pandemic, like how that affected their marriage or affected their first few years of parenting and things like that. I'm sure you've thought about that.
oh yeah, no, I mean it's like with anything, like any sort of big challenge or trauma brings an opportunity to like learn and grow. So, that's what we tried to see it as. We'll see in 5, 10 years if it helps or not. But I'm gonna say it did.
Have you read The Book of Joy by it's Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, but it's written by somebody else. Have you read that book?
No, I never have.
Okay, put it on your list of all the
Got it.
reading you're ingesting. But I actually was reading a chapter like specifically on that topic. It's like you don't want to suffering sucks. It's a terrible thing. And people go through really hard things. But the chapter I'm reading is specifically about like what we actually get out of the suffering and how much we can grow and learn from it, even though it's hard. And yeah, that's just been speaking to me. You should read that book though. I bet you would like it.
Oh, I'll check that out. No, that sounds right up my alley because I've been looking into that stuff a lot because there's this whole area of post-traumatic growth, right? Where it's like you go through very difficult things, but some people are able to come out on the other side, and we're talking very, harrowing trauma, and grow and develop from it. And I think that's such a fascinating thing because it sends kind of a message of hope while you're going through like very difficult challenges. So if we can tap into that and capture that, I think society would be a lot better.
Okay, last comment on that. And for listeners, you might want to write this down because this is a book everybody needs to read. And you mentioned Ryan Holiday. And I think I heard from him the recommendation for this book, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl. Have you read that?
Oh, it's fantastic. Yes.
It's like if I was going to tell people 5 books to read, I'd have to really think about that list, but that 100% is on the list.
Yeah, no, it's one of my favorite books of all time. And the funny thing about that book is, if I'm remembering correctly, he essentially kind of had it in his head while he was going through the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And then afterwards, like after he was free and all that, wrote it in like something like 2 or 3 weeks.
Wow. Talk about like trying to remember something when we were talking about the run.
Right, exactly.
Oh, it's just a beautiful book. And it really, so many things in life can put our own life into perspective, but that really will put everything you're going through into perspective. Okay, running career, coaching, writing. Let's start with running. We're going to go way back, Steve, so that listeners who might not have, scoured your story for 4 hours like me before this interview can learn a little bit. So if you don't know Steve was a 401 miler in high school, which is a massive deal at the time, like just kind of a phenom, right? Went on to run at the University of Houston or Rice. Where's Rice going there?
Yeah, so I went to Rice first for 2 years and then transferred to Houston afterwards.
Okay, ran super high mileage in high school. I'm curious now, like looking back at that, would you recommend a high schooler run as much as Steve Magness was running in high school?
No, I would not.
And how much were you running? Can you tell the listener?
Yeah, so I got up over 100 miles per week in high school.
Crazy.
And I think I was averaging like 85 to 90 miles like over the entire senior year of my high school. So I was running a ton.
I mean, looking back, just like, can you process that for me?
I mean, it's my personality, It's like I talked about at the beginning, is I have this kind of obsessive personality where if I go into something, I go like all in on it. And I have to be very careful of that. But when I was a high schooler, like I didn't know any better. So I loved running. I wanted to get better. And I just kept running more until, I was running 90, 100-mile weeks. And I thought it was totally normal and totally, fine because like I was enjoying it.
You were probably staying out of trouble too.
Oh yeah. No, I mean, I was dead by the end of the day. I mean, I was asleep by like, 10 o'clock as a teenager because I'd run 16 miles that day or something like that.
Tell me tell me about your parents and like what they thought about all that.
I mean, my parents thought it was a little crazy, but to their support, like they didn't push me. They weren't on me to like try and win or whatever. They were just like, look, if this is your thing, like we'll support you, go for it. And there were many times that my parents, my siblings, like got really annoyed at me, especially on family vacations because I would still run that much. And I was probably a pain in their ass, but we made it through. So they were super supportive.
It's funny that you bring that up because my husband's not like that anymore. But when he was super seriously like training, trying to get faster in the marathon, I like, and I did this for a while too. Like even on vacations, I'd be like, we got to get our 20-mile run in. Now, no way in heck would I do that. I'm like, I want to exercise on vacation because it makes me feel better and like I will enjoy my vacation more. But I'm not trying to do long runs on a vacation. Let's be real. We were just talking about this the other day because we went to California for a wedding, for a trip, a year after our first son was born. And I remember we went hiking in the woods at John Muir. I probably say that wrong. I went with his parents and I was like, what? And his mom has since passed away. So it was like it's kind of a special hike looking back, right? And I was looking back at pictures and I was like, where were you? Why aren't you in the picture? And he's like, oh, I was doing my long run. And it's just like, at the time it was fine and a perfectly normal thing to do. He then, and also a week later, I was having a major surgery, like a double mastectomy. It was a big, big season in our life. And then the week after my surgery, he went and tried to race the Chicago Marathon and totally bombed the race. And so it's just like looking back at things like that in your life, you're like, did I really need to go do that long run? Like, could I have enjoyed that hike with my family instead? But you grow and you change and you evolve. And I don't know. I mean, it's fine that he did the long run, but it's so funny looking back.
Perspective is a wonderful thing.
Totally. Okay, so off me, back to you. You end up like 401 ends up being your fastest time, right? So I just want to dive in there real quick, like processing that, like once you get into competitive running, you're running with Alan Webb and all these guys and decide like this might not be what I really want to pursue with my life, like me being a pro runner and all that.
Yeah, I think it was tough because running was so much of my identity at that point. As I said, like I'm obsessed. Like, yes, I went to college. Yes, I did fine, but I didn't care about anything. Like I was just trying to stay, be eligible so that I could compete. And then afterwards, I had very little interest in any sort of career. So I went to grad school so that essentially I could train with Alan Webb out there. So it was just like an excuse to keep training because I'm like, well, it'll look like I'm productive. I can tell my parents and family that I'm working towards something, but it's really just delaying things so that I can keep running. But at some point you just come to the realization that like, well, running is fun. I've got to do something in my life. And at that point, I was struggling because you have these expectations. I ran really fast as a high schooler, didn't get much better. And like, it's tough to grapple with something that you've put a ton of work in and essentially gone all in and not achieve your goals. So at that point, while I was trying to figure out what to do, I started like volunteer coaching high school kids. And I quickly realized that the joy of helping them improve, like, took away that, like, struggle that I was dealing with of, like, not seeing myself improve and, like, having my identity around running. So after working with, some high school kids, it really cemented in my head that I was like, okay, I want to coach. Like, I want to help other people achieve their goals, get better, and do all those things.
And you are like, the science of running, the book that you've written, like you are all in, like you know a lot. Like, let's just say that. Do you ever feel like, like I'm putting this together for all these people? Are you ever like regretful or like annoyed that you didn't put it together for yourself? I feel like kind of an ass asking the question that way, but do you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I mean, I hear you. And yeah, like when I was first getting into coaching, of course, I think I was like, oh man, like, why did I do this? Like, I shouldn't have done that. Like, if I would have done XYZ, like, I'd have performed better. But I think you have to like integrate your own challenges and maybe failures into your own story. And the way I kind of did that is like, no, it's great. I went through all these experiences, both like from an overtraining standpoint, from like a psychological standpoint of like having running being the only thing, because that allows me to pass that knowledge down and hopefully like have people or athletes or other people like avoid the same pitfalls that I did. So that kind of became like a little driving force of like, well, I know what I kind of did wrong and I know what I probably should have done right. So let's pass that knowledge down and make sure that others don't fall into the same traps that I did.
I love that. Yeah, it's like a give back kind of thing too. I remember talking with Ryan Hall about that exact same thing, and just the fact that like, yeah, there are things that like you could have done differently or maybe should have done differently. I hate the word should, to be completely honest, but now the fact that you have all that valuable knowledge in your head and can share it with other people so they don't do those same things or they can do it this way or that way is just, it's such a beautiful thing that you can give back to those people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it brings a lot to me and hopefully brings a lot to them. And I don't know. I think anytime you get stuck looking at the past and the should-haves or the would-haves, like it's not good for your mental health. So like, you hopefully learn from it, integrate it into your story, and then like pass down the knowledge that you can.
All right, friends, a quick break here. You know how much I love the Donna Foundation and the Donna Marathon Weekend. In fact, I hope you will already get it on your calendar to join us in 2023. But they have a Mother's Day 5K coming up that I'm going to do virtually here in Raleigh. We're actually going to have a group of people do it here in Raleigh, just kind of near my neighborhood. So actually, if you're local to the area, send me a DM on Instagram, LindsayHine626, or email me, lindsay@sandywayproductions.com, because we'd love to have you join us for this virtual 5K. Super casual. But this race supports the Donna Foundation, which helps people who are walking through a breast cancer diagnosis. And it's May 7th, 2022. If you are near the Jacksonville area, Jacksonville, Florida, you can go do it in person. If not, register online for the virtual event and know that you are supporting this amazing cause. Go give yourself a 5K time trial. See what you can do. Go to breastcancermarathon.com. Use the code Lindsay10 for 10% off your registration. And again, if you're local here to the Raleigh area, hit me up and do the race with me. I would love to have you. All right. Enjoy the rest of my conversation. Okay, so talk to us about the process of stepping down from University of Houston and like what your career is what's happening in your career now.
Yeah, so I was at Houston for 9 years, and then obviously I graduated there from my undergrad, so it was a really awesome, fun time. But it just came to the point where I loved working with the kids. I loved the coaching aspect. I didn't love as much the paperwork aspect of college coaching, but coaching is a college coaching is an all-in type of business. Like it takes up so much of your time. And as I said, I want to be committed. And where my career was starting to go in terms of like book projects and speaking and other opportunities working with other sports and businesses and organizations, like I was juggling, I don't know, like 10 things in the air at once. So like something had to give. And after thinking a lot about it, like the college coaching was the thing that was taking up the vast majority of my time and like preventing me maybe a little bit from like exploring other things that I wanted to. So now I'm in this phase of, as I said at the top of this podcast, like I love exploring interests and that's kind of my calling. So now I'm in this phase of like serial dabbling on things. So I've got a book project that'll come out in a couple months. I've got, I'm doing some consulting work with various professional sports teams. I'm working with post-collegiate runners, still coaching them and doing that thing. So I'm still juggling a lot, but I don't have that one thing that occupies all my time so that I can kind of compartmentalize and do a bunch of different things, hopefully well.
And how are you feeling about that? Has it been emotional at all leaving?
I mean, it definitely was at first. I mean, I feel like I felt so, it almost feels like you're abandoning your kids.
Yeah.
To a degree, because like you build up these relationships and like, you're committed to them and get to know them and you've been responsible for them and you told their parents like you'd take care of them in college and help guide them. So that was really, really difficult. Like that was the hardest part. And I just tried to just be honest and like have conversations with them on like, hey, this is why it's not you. Like, this is part of being adult is like we get put in these situations sometimes and we have these forks in the road and we got to do, what we think is best. And I can't predict the future, but like, this is what it is. And then you just try and reassure them. And, as I told them, I'm like, I'm not dead. I'm still here. Like, if you need anything, if I can help in any way, like just text or call and I'll be there.
That is one of the hardest things to do. Like leave something when it's not necessarily bad. And it's kind of like your identity is wrapped up in it a little bit, right? If you've been doing something for 9 years and it's taking the vast majority of your time, but it's time to go. I think people linger, right? Did you linger at all? Like, do you think that you did this at the right time? Or are you like, man, well, here we go with the should again. But it's like, I don't know. We want to hold on to things even if they might not be a fit for us anymore because that's just where our identity fits in.
Yeah, I think I did for a little bit. It's been in the back of my mind just as other projects and things that I've done have grown. But I think really the pandemic, like with a lot of people, kind of forced this reflection piece.
Totally.
And I was for one, for at the beginning of the pandemic, our college season was canceled for a while. So I got this taste of what it was kind of like to not, be traveling every weekend and not showing up to practice and work and doing all that stuff. So in that way, it kind of like forced that reflection piece. And even there, I went back for another year. Just to kind of, because I think at that point I went back because I was like, I don't want to end where the fact we just went to our college, conference indoor meet and then had nationals canceled. And then it's like, well, it just felt like unfulfilled. Mm-hmm. So I think going back for another year allowed me to kind of get that peace and do things a little bit differently and come to terms with it a little bit more than just like that sudden shift.
Yeah. So you mentioned consulting with other sports teams, and I know that's part of your work now. Talk to us a little bit about what you do when you're consulting with those teams.
Yeah, it's funny. I used to think like, oh, running is running, like it's its own unique thing. But then when you start branching out into the rest of the world, you realize that performance is performance and the same problems that we struggle with, both like physically and psychologically, are the same things that other people do, other sports do. So it's not like unique to us to struggle with like identity or overtraining or anxiety before a race or like working through really difficult problems or difficult times in competition. Like it happens everywhere. So what I have, kind of found myself doing is working with various, professional sports teams throughout different sports on a lot of that like performance side stuff. Like how do we put people in the best place to physically and psychologically perform, whether that's on the basketball court or on baseball, if you're a pitcher, whatever it is. Like how do you get the right, set yourself up to perform to your best of your ability? And the lessons translate. I'm like now known as bringing way too many running analogies to everything. So I try to branch out, but it's still like it's still my default.
Okay, so is this, when you do this consulting, is this in collaboration with the growth equation with Brad Stulberg?
Yeah, so Brad and I do a lot of work with because our whole deal is when Brad and I started working together, we said, hey, here's all these lessons that we kind of learned from sports and athletics and running and all this stuff, and a little bit in our working life, Brad more so in his consulting life. And we said, this stuff applies to everything. Like it's not just in our narrow little field. So over the last, I don't know, 5-6 years that we've worked together, we've kind of beat that drum and expanded and expanded. And now we're at a place where, again, we're working with sports teams or even like, major businesses and corporations trying to bring some of these lessons that, again, we largely learned from running and apply them to other fields.
I mean, I got to be honest, when I was like getting ready for this interview, even this morning after I got my kids to school, I was like trying to be super organized and manage my time super well. And I think that's because I've like listened to your podcast and paid attention to the work that you and Brad have done, Passion Paradox. I've read that. I've read Peak Performance. I've read all these books. And I don't know, sometimes you get lost and you forget about those methods and those things that you teach. But just knowing I was connecting with you today motivated me to be more efficient.
Well, I'll take that as a win.
Yeah.
I'm glad. But that's kind of what it is. I mean, we're all human.
Yeah.
So we all get like dragged off to other things. Like even the best performers in the world, like we tend to think like, oh, they're locked in. They always are on. They're always like want to get out the door and run. But it's just not true. They struggle with the same things that like you and I do. So a lot of it is just, sometimes having that reminder of like, oh yeah, I should do this instead of, spending this 20 minutes dabbling on my phone or scrolling or whatever it is.
Can you talk about, I was kind of looking through like some of the different articles you've written and things like that. Can you talk about what identifying the limiting factor is, both in like training, but also for me, I'm thinking about with work, like what is my limiting factor that's keeping me from like going to the next level? What is someone's limiting factor?
Yeah. So in training, we all kind of get caught up into like, oh, what's the best training system? Like, should we run high mileage or high intensity and all this stuff? But the way I like to look at it is like, as you grow and develop as an athlete, your limiting factor, that thing that is like the kink in the pipe in terms of your performance, shifts and changes. And your goal as an athlete or as a coach is to figure out, okay, where's that weak point that is like preventing me to take that next step? And it could be something as simple as, my endurance isn't as good as it should be, or my resistance to injury isn't as good, or my pure basic speed isn't where it needs to be. The classic example is if I'm gonna run a 4-minute mile, I better be significantly faster than 60 seconds in a 400, right? So like that simple idea I think is really powerful because it tells you, hey, like where do I need to like put my focus and attention in this moment so that I can like get rid of that kink in the pipe, and then that factor will shift. And I think the same thing applies to our work life. Like we all have something that we struggle at that like gets in the way of performing at whatever we're doing, whether that's writing, whether that's podcasting, whatever your job entails. So for example, my limiting factor in writing at this moment while I'm finishing up a book is like locking in time to give me like that deep focus, right? I know if I can sit down for 2 hours, then I'm gonna finish this stuff. But the problem with all these other commitments is like finding that time. So what do I have to do? I have to be very intentional on blocking out my schedule for, let's say, the next 4 weeks to make sure that I reserve that time for this thing that is really important during this season of life. During my next season of life, when I go from like finishing up the writing and all that to the promoting, then my kind of limiting factor shifts and changes.
Yeah, I think that's so difficult. What do you do when you're having a writer's block? I know we talked about going out for runs and things like that, but like, what if you are in that blocked time that you have specifically created for yourself and it's not happening?
Oh gosh. I mean, really runs are the best thing, or walks. This is where my dog comes in handy. He is my cure for writer's block because he always wants to go for a walk. So short walks are great. But really it's stepping away. Like I almost see it, it's almost like interval training for your brain, right? You're in the thick of it, you're writing really hard, and then you get just blocked. What is that kind of the equivalent of? It's like being in the middle of a workout. All of a sudden you get super fatigued and you're slowing down and you're not doing what you're able to do. Well, how do you fix that? You can either call it for the day, or you can just take a lot of rest and be like, you know what? I got to recover before I get this next repeat in. And that's kind of how I see it with writer's block, is whether that rest is a walk or going for a run, whether it's getting up and just like doing something different for 5-10 minutes, washing the dishes, cleaning the house, whatever it is that like takes my mind off of writing mode and occupies it with something else. Like that to me is the cure. It's almost like that restorative sense that frees up my mind to kind of wrestle with whatever I was blocked on. And if all that fails, then I just go back to that exploration mode we talked about. Like go back, read something, listening to something, that's kind of related to the book. And I find that getting yourself in that like reading, consuming mode often frees you up to figure out how to deal with the problem.
I love that. Yeah. You know what I do before an interview, like when I need to get in the zone? I almost always, if I have time, if I'm not like rushing to the microphone, I will just put on music for like 10 minutes and like kind of dance around a little bit sometimes, or like just kind of like put myself up to get in the mode of talking to someone, because, being on an interview, you have to like turn on a little bit, right? And if you're working from home and you're alone most of the day and you're not talking to people, it's like a weird shift. So I think finding those things that like turn you to the place you need to be is so important. Do you ever listen to music to prep for writing or talking on your podcast?
Oh, 100%.
What do you listen to?
So this sounds really weird, but I tend to pick like one band.
Okay.
And just listen to them over and over and over and over again for a buck.
The same book. Okay.
So the same thing.
I get that, because it's like a vibe. It's a whole vibe.
Yeah. It's like I don't know why I did this. I just kind of stumbled on it, but it's almost like my brain connects like listening to this like one band to like, oh, it's writing mode. Like let's get in the mode. So that's what works for me, and I do that all the time. And I think it's no different. I'm going to tie everything back to running because that's what I do.
It's a running podcast.
But, so it works. This is why I love this podcast. Yeah. But it's no different than like getting ready for a race, right? You have specific like rituals you might do. You might listen to music to pump yourself up. Or if you're like too amped up, you might like listen to a different kind of music to like calm yourself down, or talk to friends to calm yourself down. It's the same thing regardless of what you're doing. Like if we're stepping up to the mic on a podcast, like I do the same thing. It's a performance. Like if I'm sluggish, then like I'm going to listen to music, or even like jump around a little bit or do jumping jacks, something to like get that energy flowing where I can be in the like focused state of mind where it's like, okay, I got to have my mind sharp and ready because Lindsay's going to ask like really good questions and I want to be able to give like the best answers that I can. And I'm not going to be able to do that if I'm just like languishing and tired and like, out of it. So I got to get in the right state.
Okay. We have to circle back around to the bands if you're willing to share what you listen to. But before that, I have to ask, you mentioned the social interaction, and I read somewhere that you said that like social interaction is perhaps like the most important key to recovery. And as we're talking, I'm just thinking about that because, you say, oh, if I'm tired or fatigued, I might not be able to give sharp answers. But isn't it interesting how the second you actually have that social interaction, it kind of just wakes you up? It's like, I'm tired this morning. I don't know why. I didn't sleep well last night. I kind of have a little headache. But the second we got on the line, I'm fine. I'm awake. So talk about that social interaction piece as it relates to like recovery from training, but also just recovering from anything in life.
Yeah, no, I think it's one of the best things that you can do. And there's really good research on this for two reasons, essentially. One is like we're human. We're meant to like have social interaction. It's one of our basic like needs. So when we fulfill that need, we feel better, right? We feel connected. The other thing is it allows, especially from a recovery standpoint, is it takes you out of this like stressed fight or flight mode and puts you in what I'd call like a positive stress mode, which is more of like a learn, recover, repair mode. So in terms of after training or after a race or whatever, you're so stressed physically because you just did a very hard workout that was incredibly stressful, or a very hard race that was psychologically and physically stressful. You've got all these stress hormones running rampant, which is fine. Like that's what's supposed to occur. But what the research shows is that if you can switch out of that mode and in towards a more kind of positive, like open up, like accepting mode, then you're going to recover faster, right? Because the problem with stress hormones isn't that they get high, they linger. And if they linger for hours, then we get that like, run down kind of state. So shooting the shit with others, like talking with friends, is the best thing that you can do because it's like it's our body's natural antidote. It's like it gives this sense of calm and connection that you can't get anywhere else. So yeah, after you've done something hard, like that's why as a coach, I'm always like engineering the cool down because I'm like, no, go cool down with
Together.
Your friends. Like, don't do it by yourself, because you're cooling down, but you're getting that social interaction naturally. And it's the same thing with why, coaches of all sports sometimes like, okay, let's have a meal right after the game or right after the race. It's the same stuff. Like get the social interaction going and good things happen.
Yeah, that's so good. Everybody should take that advice in general. I have a group of women in my neighborhood. They're going to train for a 5K and I'm going to like write a plan and we're all going to go together. And one of the ladies suggested last night at 7:30, we go do our run walk. And I had already done my run for the day and I'm using this as like my social hour, right? And part of me is like, 7:30 on a weekday? Are you kidding me? Like, I don't want to leave the house. What, go exercise that late. But I just knew that like dose of social time would just do so much for me emotionally. And I think sometimes we resist it because it's like easier to stay inside, or like it feels like it's going to be a lot of work to like muster up conversation and get through the small talk to get to the real talk. But I can't really think of many times in my life where I've been like, I really regret going and like socializing with these people,
Yeah, no, it's one of those things that is often hard to get going, but once you do, you don't regret it.
Yeah.
And same thing. I have the same experience, and I'm by nature like an introvert, so social interaction, I'm just like, I'd rather stay in and read a book. But like forcing myself to get out and go for a walk or run with my friends or meet them up for dinner or a meal or whatever, like I just remind myself, I'm like, this is good for you. You never regret this.
Yeah.
Like this will put you in a better like state of mind. Like go get it done. And it's true. Like it always leaves me feeling better, more refreshed, and even more energized for whatever else I have to do.
Okay, what's the band? Is this a big secret or can we hear?
No, it's fine. So for my current book that I'm working on, I listen to the band Churches.
Okay, I've never heard of them.
And then for Passion Paradox, I listen to Weezer.
Weezer. Okay, interesting. One time I heard someone say they listened to John Mayer nonstop when they were writing their book, and I was like, that's interesting. But some of his music, I could kind of see that like writing vibe. I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about this if I ever write anything in depth. That's gonna be a big deal. I'm like right now, I feel like my default would just be Taylor Swift.
That's a good pick. So I wouldn't complain about that.
Yeah, her pandemic albums seem like they'd be good writing albums. Hey friends, one more quick break here. Do you need a new GPS watch? Have you tried Coros yet? They are amazing. I've had my Coros watch since 2018. So many pros are wearing the Coros watch. Camille Herron, Molly Seidel, Sally McRae, Parker Stinson, Hayden Hawks. The list goes on. This watch has the most insane battery life. It's so easy to program your workouts. It just uploads to your phone too, like your Coros app on your phone, which then just uploads directly to Strava or VDOT or wherever your workouts need to go. I highly recommend the Coros watch. And they have lots of fun colors for the straps as well. So the cool thing is when you go to Coros.com and use the code ANOTHER, you can get an extra band with your purchase. So make sure you add that extra band to your cart and then check out and use the promo code ANOTHER. My husband actually just bought a Coros watch and he got me an extra band for my Coros watch with his purchase, which was super exciting. So if you're thinking about checking it out, go to Coros.com, use the code ANOTHER, and get yourself an extra band. And I can guarantee you will not be disappointed with this watch. All right, friends, enjoy the rest of my conversation with Steve Magness. Okay, I want to direct everybody. I'm going to ask you a little bit about Nike Oregon Project, but we won't talk about it too much. I want to direct everybody to the Clean Sport Collective podcast you did, episode 26, if they want to like hear a deep dive on that, because everything is talked about there. But I am curious, and for those listening who might not know, Steve worked with Nike Oregon Project, Alberto Salazar for a long time, and then was the whistleblower on everything that happened there. In a nutshell, if you could just like tell us like how that part of your life changed your perspective on the sport and how everything is run. And, then you went on to coach, at a different university for a long time. And I'm just curious, like how it changed your perspective on everything. I know it's a big question.
Yeah, no, it really did. Because honestly, like whistleblowing that whole thing was a major part of my life for probably 10 years.
It's a long time.
Which is not what I expected at the beginning when this happened. So, I talked about we got to integrate things into your story. Well, that was kind of forced as like now a major part of my story, both for myself and then more so to the wider world, where it's like, oh, here's this thing that, is in all the newspapers and then everywhere. So it's like, oh, people know me for this. Like, this is really weird. So I just had to kind of come to terms with it. And I think in terms of how it affected my view of the sport, it gave me some much needed perspective on what was important and what mattered. I think early in my career, like everybody, I thought, running fast times is what mattered. Coaching people to, world championships or Olympic games or whatever accolades or accomplishments is what mattered. But this really focused me on none of that stuff really matters. Like it's a game that we're all playing, and sure, it's kind of important, and sure, like I want people to accomplish their goals, and setting hard goals and going for them is important, but we can't get lost in the sense that, putting those accomplishments above all else, that just leads to bad places. And I saw that firsthand with my work there. And then the other thing that I think was really important, and a lesson that I try to remind myself of today, is that we tend to think of the world as kind of black and white, as either like you're good or you're bad, or you do the right things or you do the wrong things. And I think humans, like, it's just not that easy. It's much more nuanced than that. And having been in the situation that I was in with the Nike Oregon project, I quickly found out and realized how important the people you surround yourself with are in the environment you're in. And that environment and those people can either nudge you in a positive direction or in a direction away from things that you hold as like core values. And, if the organization and the people around you are strong enough, like your core values don't really mean as much as you think they do. So like it really honed in on make sure in my life I have good people who reflect similar things that I want or I strive to be, and that are pushing me in a good direction. And if I do that, like I'll be okay.
That is fascinating to think about too, because I've heard you say that, like leaving that place, and Kara as well, Kara Goucher, it's like leaving a cult, right? Like, and so I wonder if we can all think about like where we are in our lives and the people we surround ourselves with. Are we surrounding ourselves with people outside that main group that we're hanging out with all the time? And not to say that like our groups that we hang out with are cult-like the Nike Oregon Project or, whatever, weird church cult or whatever. But I just think that emphasizes the importance of making sure that we are extending our circles, right?
Yeah, no, I it's like diversify your friend group and diversify where you find meaning.
Yeah.
And it's almost like you have to, it's a hedge against like falling into that like cult-like atmosphere, because it's so easy to do, especially when your identity and your self-worth and your financial whatever is dependent on it, even more so. So you just gotta like set your life up so that you have people that, have different point of views that are away from your, inner circle, or your kind of, your kind of inner circle, who can call you back and call you out and be like, hey, this is kind of weird, Steve. Like, I don't know about this, You need people like that in your life. So I'm very intentional to make sure that I have that now after having gone through that.
And you mentioned your identity. I'm going to give an example here and ask you a question on this. So like in 2013, I mentioned I had a big surgery. I had a mastectomy. I'm positive for the BRCA2 gene mutation. And then I had all these interviews and everybody asks me about that. And I kind of like stopped talking about it a little bit because I was like, I don't want that to be like my identity, right? Like that's a part of my story. But like when people think about me, I don't want it to always be like, oh yeah, Lindsay did this and that was brave and courageous or whatever. And so I kind of like moved away from it a little bit. And the reason I bring that up is because, when you decided to do the whistleblowing thing, it's like, how much of your identity then, when people look at Steve Magness, are they going to think, oh, he's the guy that did this, right? And it's like, that was a risk you took because you want your work and your life and everything you've done to be like so much more than that. Like that was a huge thing that you did, and like the sport should be forever grateful for what you did, but like also all of your writing and all the other things, and it's like you want to be known for the other things as well. So did you calculate that, and how does that sit with you now?
Yeah, I think that was one of the biggest challenges. And I still remember it, actually. I was sitting in my office, and one of my good friends and mentors, like the thing just broke, the Nike stuff just broke, and he was like, Steve, you might have just found the thing that everybody's going to know you for the rest of your life, and I hope you're ready for that. And, it kind of is true. Like, I had to come to terms with that, and I think I struggled with that at first. Because like, who wants to be known as, is good, it's whatever, but who wants to be known as like the person who blew the whistle on this for the rest of their life? I was in my, late 20s when I blew the whistle. So like, I've hopefully got a long life to live and a lot of things to do. So I didn't. And I think that was part of why I also branched away and branched out of the running world, to make sure that like I had this extra space where people didn't know me through like whistle blowing and running. So I remember having these conversations with Brad when we first started to work together and started work on peak performance and begin the growth equation. And I was like, I just need this outlet where I'm doing some work in an area where people have no idea who I am. Mm. And I think that was one of the best decisions that I made while going through this, because it allowed me to like separate and have this other area of my life where I could get, meaning, I could escape from the whistleblowing thing, do good work, and not be like caught up in it.
I love that. That's so good. Yeah, I'm sure that it was super challenging. This is kind of maybe an annoying question, but like with the clean sport and whatnot, right? It's a big topic. What do you think needs to happen to like the incentives are so high, right? Like the stakes are so high. And I specifically think of someone maybe from like another country that grew up super poor, right? The stakes are so high. Like, oh my gosh, I can make millions of dollars and feed my village or whatever it is. Like, it's a really, really big thing. Like, what do you think in the sport globally and nationally needs to happen to make it so that like it's not so tempting to some people?
Yeah, people in that position, I have a lot of sympathy for, or empathy for, because like it's so hard. And growing up in the West, like I wouldn't know what that's like. But I think the answer is kind of straightforward in the sense that, we put a lot of fault on the athletes, and rightfully so. They're the ones taking stuff. But I think the system, if you look at drug use in sport, it's not the one-off athletes that are often the problem. Like, it's not the athlete who figures out, hey, I'm going to go buy this performance enhancing drug online and use it. Like, that is relatively rare. Normally, when people cross that line, it comes with help. Mm-hmm. So we need to change like the punishments and incentives, I think, on the people who have more power, which are like the coaches, the agents, the organizations or sponsors or teams or whatever have you, who like develop these cultures that make it like more easily accessible for athletes or push them towards doing this stuff. And I think it's almost like the analogy of, do you go after the guy who buys cocaine on the street, or do you go after the drug dealer?
Sure.
And I think in our sport, we've often gone after the guy on the street who's buying the stuff. And I think we need to put more emphasis on, okay, the drug dealer, for lack of a better, term.
And then I think this is my last question on this. It depends on.
It's fine.
Depends on how your answer is. It's funny, when I started this podcast, I was like, I am not going to dive into doping stuff. It's just like, it's everywhere and everybody talks about it. And I haven't talked about it much on the show, but someone like you, I'm super interested on your perspective. And I'm married to someone who gets a little bit cynical about, doping stuff. I mean, we used to be like Tour de France. Like, we used to love watching that stuff. And now it's just like, blah, who's not doping? So I'm curious your thoughts on, like, how do we remain not cynical about it? And, like, when massive performances happen, how do we, like, celebrate that and not be like, I wonder,
That's the hard thing. And that's the battle that I fight too, is how cynical do you get? Because cynicism can, like, ruin your love for sport.
Totally.
Especially, so I fight that battle as well, and I don't have the answer. But what I try and do is I root for people who seem like the good guys. And I know I said it's more nuanced than that, and it is. But having been in the sport long enough, like, I have a decent idea of what coaches, what groups, what athletes are, you never know, but are more likely than not doing things the right way. And I direct, like, all my fanhood towards those people. So, like, that's my solution. And if they do something crazy and impressive, then I'm like, 100% fan. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. I try not to question it. Now, there's other sides or other people or other groups, and this is the part that sucks, that I'm a little more skeptical of. So if they do things that are kind of mind-blowing, then I'm like, well, I'm just not going to pay attention to it. Like, I won't celebrate it. I'm not going to dog on them. Like, but I'm just, like, not going to even think about it, really. I'm going to celebrate the people who I can feel good celebrating and, enjoy that aspect of the sport.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that, I don't know. It's really hard. I like that advice, though. I like it. Okay. One more training question, and then we'll have to wrap up with end of podcast, because we could talk forever, but I'm going to try to keep us on track here. I know that, I think any good coach knows that individualized training is super important. And so as a coach, as someone who's coached young athletes, professional athletes, how do you make sure that you are individualizing training? And as you grow with the athlete, I'm sure you, like, figure things out, right? So, like, how do you do that?
Yeah. So it starts with getting to know the athlete. So I always see coaching as a partnership, and that partnership should lead to more independence and less dependence. So I always, like, start with the athlete, like, asking them questions, like, from their motivation to what's worked in the past to what hasn't worked. I try and, with any new athlete I work with, I try and do a deep dive on kind of their past training, and what's worked and what hasn't. And I'm trying to essentially categorize them roughly and say, okay, you tend to work better doing X, or you tend to work better doing Y. And I start with that, like, big model, and then I'm, like, adjusting as I go based on what I notice in training and what feedback they're giving me. And I think as long as you're open to it, that is, like, as long as you approach things with an open mindset and a learning mindset, that's the whole key to individualization. Where we go wrong is when we sit here and we say, I believe in my training system, and my training system is XYZ, and it includes this workout and this much mileage and this approach. If you're married to that training system, you're not going to individualize. Instead, what you need to do is have, like, this rough heuristic, like this rough model of these things generally work. But let's look at the athlete sitting in front of me and see what they're bringing to the table. And I'm going to fit that into my kind of philosophy and beliefs. And then the last thing on individualization that I think is really important is having regular check-ins and dialogues. So, whenever I'm coaching someone, probably once a month or during specific times in the period, we'll have kind of a organized like, hey, how are you doing? How do you think you're progressing? Where do you think you're still weak? All of those things. And I try and take that information and then change and adjust things in the training program or the coaching to make sure that, I'm listening and adjusting to their feedback.
Selfish question. What's your advice to someone who's like a lower mileage runner but still wants to run kind of fast? Because like injury wise, like I probably shouldn't train over like 50-ish miles a week. Like I get injured even if I'm doing strength training if I do too many miles. So what's your advice? Like what should people that are wanting to like run a faster marathon but they're sticking to like a 50 or less mile per week plan, like what should we focus on?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think first, it's good to have the awareness to know like where your kind of breaking point is when you get hurt. Like it's dumb to push through just because someone says, hey, you need X many miles for the marathon. So in that case, what I'm doing is I would say, if we're talking about the marathon, I would say, okay, we're limited mileage. How can we get the best bang for our buck for the things that matter most? So in the marathon, it's like preparing your body to run 26.2 miles, which is, we need something long. We need something prolonged fatigued. We need like some sort of steady running, right? And if that's going to take a big chunk of your mileage, then sometimes it's like you get creative with how you do things. So I'll give you an example for low mileage runners. Like, yes, the long run is important, but the other part of it is, well, we need some sustained like marathon pace work, but we can't, go do a ton of mileage at it because our overall mileage is limited. So what I would suggest there is, well, how do you maybe create pre-fatigue so that instead of having to do, 13 miles at marathon pace, we can get away with doing 8 miles and have a similar training, stimulus. So you could do that in a number of ways. You could say, hey, I'm going to do some sort of general strength training circuit for 20, 30 minutes before I go do my workout. You could hop on a bike and say, I'm going to go for a, 30, 40 minute bike ride and then go do my, my workout. Or this gets a little more trickier, and I've only done this with pros, but same deal as you can say, you know what? The marathon is about fueling, but I'm not going to go run 20 whatever miles to work on my fueling. So maybe I wake up and don't eat breakfast in the morning and go out and run 12, 13, 14 miles. And because I didn't eat breakfast, I'm already entering that a little low on fuel. So I'm going to get lower on fuel earlier in the run than I would if I was fully fueled. Now there's dangers in all of this stuff because it's like you're changing the stress. But the overall thing is, if you're limited in terms of your mileage, I would think of, okay, how can I shift the stress to increase it in a little different ways outside of just running more that allow me to get like that stimulus for adaptation so that I'm still getting some of those key features for that allow me to prepare for the marathon.
I've never heard that answer. I love that. Yeah, I don't know that I've ever asked a question exactly like that, but I love that idea. Okay. Because I always do my, if I'm doing like a leg workout or something, I always do that after a hard run. Ooh, put that in before the hard run and see how that feels.
Yeah, it's not very fun, but it works. It's actually, I borrowed that from the legendary Arkansas coach John McDonnell.
Okay.
Who with his athletes would often have them do like their strength training, and then on an easy day he'd go out. They'd then right after the workout go out and run 8 miles, and he was like, well, that 8 miles is going to feel like 13 or 14 miles because their legs are going to be dead. So I think it has some. I mean, if John McDonnell did it, then I think it has some merit.
Isn't that interesting when you come up with an idea though? Like Somebody's got to be the guinea pig here.
Yeah, I know,
Right?
right? No, my athletes know that. I will be very, very clear with them, but I'm be like, I think this might work. Like, I have this theory, but we're gonna try this. So, for instance, real quickly,
Yeah.
in Houston, we don't have hills, right?
Uh-huh.
It's all flat everywhere. So with the university, whenever we were training for some cross country course that I knew was going to be super hilly, I was like, well, we're gonna be done for. So what we would do, and it worked pretty well, is I got this idea is, you know what? We have this like bridge, this overpass that's like 100 meters, and that's our hill. So to stimulate a long hill, what we're going to do is we're just going to, at the bottom of the hill, before you sprint up, we're just going to do like squats and burpees and all this stuff, and then go straight into sprinting up the hill. And they hated it. But then when we came to this really hilly course, they were like, thank goodness we did that crazy workout, because our legs were dead and it prepared us for like running up this 800-meter hill. So sometimes you got to try crazy stuff. You just got to be honest with your athletes while you're trying it.
I moved from Indianapolis to Raleigh, and Indianapolis is so flat, and everywhere I go here in Raleigh, it is so hilly. Like, I ran 10 miles on Sunday, and I think my average pace was like 8:20. And it felt like my average pace was like 7:20. I mean, it is insane, the difference that it makes. When someone is in a super hilly area, like, how does that translate to a flat course? I mean, I know I'm getting stronger because I'm running on hills all the time, but like, will I be able to really run fast on a flat course? Because I'm not trained to really run super fast anymore because I'm only running on hills.
Yeah, I think it does. I think it translates like differently, because when you're running up and down hills, you're changing the strength component, and you're also changing a little bit on how your muscle fibers are recruited. So you're like, when you run uphill, you're recruiting muscle fibers you normally don't. So that gives you like this added training effect. So it's great. And then when you run on the flat ground, like when everything's fatigued and tired, theoretically you can pull on these like fibers that don't really do much when you're running on flat ground. But when everything else is fatigued and dead and no longer using, you can utilize these. So I think it pays off. The thing that I would say, and this is kind of my general rule of thumb, is just make sure you're doing something that you're not normally getting. So if you're running up and down hills all the time and not running as fast as you normally would, well, go find a flat ground and just do some fast work just to turn over, so you get something like that. It's the same with if you're at altitude, you run slower. Well, make sure you're doing something very short that isn't, too fatiguing, that you're running really fast, and you'll be all right.
Man, I love a day where I get to get on the treadmill and get off these hills. It is like, I mean, and we do have some flat on the greenways here. Like, you can find it, or you could obviously go to a track, but like, I've really been enjoying just like putting up the garage door, getting on the treadmill and doing like some shorter intervals. It just, I don't know, it's a break. Those hills, man, whew, they are taxing. Didn't realize I'd ever be in a place where I was going to be. Our neighborhood too, it's called North Hills. It is hills. Okay, Steve, end of podcast questions. You are already going to be a favorite guest of mine, so thank you so much for everything. I can just tell already, like, this interview, people are going to eat it up.
Oh, thanks.
What is something professionally or personally that you would like to do that you have not done yet?
All right, I'm going to give the cop-out of all cop-out answers, but if you listened all the way to the end of this podcast, it makes sense. I try and stay away from like goals.
Okay.
And like things that I want to accomplish, probably because of my running career, but whistleblowing, all that stuff. So I don't do that. I'll tell you what I do instead, and I've mentioned it several times, is I try to give myself the space to explore things that are interesting and explore them long enough to see if there's something that like is there. So like that is my goal. If you're asking, well, what do I want to do? Well, I want to have the space or time where if something that seems like it would be cool to do professionally or personally, I want to be able to like at least dabble in that and see if it's worthwhile doing.
Do you have anything you're like, maybe I'll be interested in that right now?
Good question. I mean, all of my recent work has been surrounded on getting this book project done. So most of that is on that, which it's on redefining toughness. So that's my current interest. We'll see what happens next.
Yeah, it's like, how do we decide what we want to make time for, right? Like ever since I moved here, everybody asks me, "Do you play tennis? Do you play tennis?" Everybody here plays tennis, and I'm like, I've literally never played tennis in my entire life, but it's starting to interest me because I'm like, could that be a social thing for me? Could that be really fun? I've always wanted to like plant a nice garden, but it's like, do I really want to make time for that? Do I just like the idea of the garden? Would I really enjoy the process of it? And so I think, and I think that's a lot of the work that you and Brad do is like trying to decipher, like, does this make sense for my life right now?
Yeah, 100%. And all I would say is like that's my goal is if gardening seems like something that's interesting, I want to make time so that I can at least attempt a garden.
Yeah.
And if I find out I hate it, great. I just won't do it.
Yeah.
Figured it out. So like that's what I'm trying to do. It's just like figure things out.
Yeah. It's like I want to, like if I do it, I don't want to be thinking about the work I need to be doing. I don't want to be thinking about the fact that I should right now in this moment be prepping for my Steve Magness interview. Like the time that I dedicate to the gardening or the tennis, like I want it to be all in with tennis or gardening. And yeah, that is a struggle.
Yeah, no, I think that's the struggle of modernity is like, especially we have so many things that pull our attention.
Mm-hmm.
So having something where you can be just focused on that is so vital and so important.
Yeah. What is the best, most recent book you've read?
Oh man, my best, most recent book. So I would probably say 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman.
Okay.
So it's like a time management book, but it's really the anti-time management book because the title gives it away. It's essentially our average lifespan is about 4,000 weeks. So if you're stressed out about optimizing everything, it's just not realistic and you're never going to do it. So like optimize for things that actually matter and then just realize that you're never going to accomplish everything you want to or get everything checked off on the to-do list, and that's totally fine and totally okay.
Yeah, we have to accept that. The beginning page of the book, The Midnight Library, which I have recommended to so many people. Have you read it?
No.
I won't say it verbatim because I won't remember, but it's just something about like how you're never going to be able to do all the things and be all the things and invest in all the things that you really like. You want all these lives inside your one life. And like the fact of the matter is like, it's just not possible.
Yeah. No, I think like coming face to face with the reality is important. Like it's like a marathon. Again, me and my running analogies, but if I go into the marathon and I think, oh, this is great, this is going to be a cakewalk, well, it's going to be a disaster. If I have a realistic approach to like, this is going to be kind of difficult, it's going to hurt really bad at this, then I'm better prepared. So face the reality of what you're doing.
Yeah. I know. I don't want to think. It's like it's hard because I'm like I can't think about that quote too much. It kind of makes me a little bit sad, but I think we do have to be realistic and like just accept it. We gotta accept it. Who is someone fun, motivating, or inspiring you would like to have coffee, tea, or cocktail with?
Is this person alive or dead?
It can be anybody. They can be dead.
Okay. Gosh, there's so many people. I'll just go like history nerd on myself. I think Abraham Lincoln would be fascinating.
If you could ask him one question, what would it be?
Oh gosh.
That's hard.
I think really, so in his case, it would be like, I don't know. I have no idea, but I think it would be something around the line of like, how do you keep optimism and resolve when a country is falling apart? Because that's like what he was able to kind of do And I think that's amazing. And I'd love to get into that mindset of like how that's done, because it's astonishing.
I put you on the spot there. I mean, let's be honest. If you were really having coffee, tea, or cocktail with Abraham Lincoln and you could ask one question, you'd probably think about that question for a long time. You can't pull that out in an interview.
I would. I know. That's where I'm like, I don't know.
I can't answer that.
You know.
I love that answer, though. That's a fun one. Okay, here's our last question. What message would you like to leave with the audience today?
Oh, gosh. One thing. I would do real things with real people in the real world.
People are losing their minds on the internet.
You know, Brad and I have spent a lot of time thinking about this, and way too many of our conversations are in this. But I'm not anti-internet. I make my living off the internet, so I think it's great. But I think we have to counterbalance that and be extremely intentional on counterbalancing that. So, yeah, be intentional and getting out in the real world, and as we talked about on this podcast, having social interaction with others and having people outside of, you know, just your kind of inner circle, and diversifying your sources of meaning. And if you can do that, regardless of what you're pursuing, your life will be all right.
I like that, diversifying your sources of meaning. I can't tell you how many times I've like run down to the kitchen and been like, you know, this person said this or something to my husband, and he's like, the internet is not real life. Twitter is not the real world. And I'm like, I know, but it does infiltrate in your brain. And then, you know, like last night I went on that walk with those ladies, and it's like, nobody's talking about that on that walk.
Exactly.
We're talking about our kids, and like, if we're going to add on to our house, or, you know, like what, somebody went to the doctor for something, like, and nobody's talking about that stuff.
Exactly. You know, it's true. You put it perfectly. Like, it infiltrates our brain. And there's a lot of good things about social media and Twitter and all that stuff. But there's a lot of things that make your kind of life distorted. So you just, like, that's why that walk is great, because it like recenters you and focuses you on like, oh, this thing that I thought was like the end of the world and everyone was talking about. Well, you know, we're not. No one's thinking about it. Like, it's not as big of a deal as we think. So maybe I shouldn't get as angry about it.
Yeah. I love that. Well, Steve, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to talking to you again. What do you probably haven't said the title of the new book yet.
So we just finalized it. It's called Do Hard Things.
Ooh, good. Are you writing it with Brad, or is this a solo project?
No, this one's a solo project, although Brad spent many, many hours talking about it. So
also a whole nother conversation, the importance of having friendships like you and Brad.
Yes. No, it is vital.
That's so good. All right, Steve, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. Thank you, Steve, for sharing your story, for sharing your message. You have so many great things to say. I know I took a lot from this episode myself, and I know the listeners did as well. You all can find Steve on Instagram. He is Steve Magness over there. And you're going to want to check out his books if you haven't already done so. So many great books. He also has a podcast, the Growth Equation Podcast with Brad Stulberg. And you can learn more about everything he's doing at stevemagness.com. Friends, you can find me personally on Instagram. I'm Lindsay Hine 626 over there. Lindsay Hine on Twitter. And we have a great Facebook group, All Have Another, as well. We'd love to have you joining our conversations over there. This podcast is part of the Sandy Boy Productions Podcast Network. I also host a podcast for parents. It's called Why Is Everyone Yelling? Something I find myself saying quite a bit. Check it out if you're interested in all sorts of topics related to raising kids. Friends, have a great rest of your day. Best of luck with your Boston taper. I hope it's going well if anybody's running Boston. And we will see you next week. Have a great Friday, a wonderful rest of the weekend, and we'll see you next Friday. Thanks for being here.